Welcome to Breaking Paradigms, a podcast where we talk about global perspectives on spatial planning in practice and theory, by Constanze Frech and Kusché.
Today's podcast about how does the city relate to food and food relate to the city is the start of our second season. And to get us started, I have a short quote for you. Food has always been a public object and activity, as well as a domestic concern. From the emergence of hucksters, hawkers, and street peddlers to grocery stores, markets, and restaurants. Groups of people, large and small, have always produced and consumed food publicly.
So, welcome to this episode. So, as it's our very first episode of the second season, we thought we could start this a little more general. And so it was the idea that we should define public space. What is public space? What do people actually do in public space? And what is actually public? What does that actually mean? So we wanted to start at the very basics and dive a little into economic theories and the theory of public goods.
So when we talk about public goods or the word public in general, when we talk about it in terms of economics, there's two different types of spectrums. There is the exclusivity and there's the rivalry. And when we look at which goods fall into which category, we see that public goods are always non-rival and non-exclusive. So think, for example, of a public park that you can access. No matter if you access it or not, there is always a spot for you, and it's not exclusive. You don't have to pay an entrance fee. You don't have to participate in anything particular. On the other hand, a non-rival good that is a club good, that is an exclusive good, is a club good. Think of your common golf club, where you can only access the greens, for example, when you actually pay access, but probably the amount of people who can join that club doesn't have a hard limit. Then there are the rival but non-exclusive goods, which include the common pool goods. These are usually in the public sphere, in the sense that you might consider a public field for grazing of animals a common pool good, but it is rival in the sense that the more people participate in these goods, the more people participate on this land, the more it gets diminished. So in that sense, it is rival, unlike the good of joining a public park, because you diminish the good and it's more scarce. And then there are those goods that are rival and exclusive, that is private goods. And in terms of space, we would consider apartments or houses, all this kind of things, private goods.
So, and how do we use public space? In general, there are two ways of using public space: transit or stay. So when you move from A to B in the city, you use the public space, and so there are many ways of transit uses in the space, all kinds of transportation systems. or walking, biking. So you move from one spot in the city to another one. So you use the public space as a transit space. Or you stay at the public space. And there are many cases why people stay in public spaces. And eating is one of them. But in general, there are three cases why people stay in the public space. They either want to stay, or they have to stay, or a mixture of both. So if you want to stay, there are also many reasons. So you want to feel the city, you appreciate the public space, you appreciate the park you stay. So this is mainly tourism or leisure, why people want to stay outside. But people also sometimes have to stay in public space. For example, if they work on the street, or they use the street for private purposes, like parking or selling food or other goods, or also for shelter by the means of squatting. But also because they have a lack of private space. And there's also a mixture of both. If you prefer the public space to a place of consumption, if you prefer to sit on a park bench, prefer the park bench to a place in a cafe, for example, or if you prefer reading in the park to your personal couch at your home, or you prefer to stay somewhere outside your office to your work's canteen, for example.
And the interesting thing about all these different types of stay uses is that the legal framework of any given space might influence the legality, but we notice that globally speaking, the uses are quite consistent. So when we think of why do people, for example, eat in public space, but not only eat, also produce food in public space, as Constanze said, there is a plethora of reasons why you might do that, not in your private home. Maybe you want to not spend money on a restaurant, or you just prefer to do that. So there's always this duality between want and have to. And to kick us off again, there's a short quote which is in regards to the city of New York and how public space can be used there. First of all, to the transportable garden furniture, umbrellas and planting pots caught my attention. New York tells you, I offer you a break for free. Sit down, eat, nap, chat. It's a nice act, an offer to feel the dense urban fabric of New York with all your senses.
So this is the way New York deals and invites its inhabitants to stay outside. But there are also many various reasons why people eat in public. For example, time constraints. If people have to move from one place to the other and don't find time to eat at one place and use the time of commuting, for example, the commute to work to have their breakfast. So many people eat, for example, on a train or on the way to work. So, and there's a big tradition even in Japan of eating on the train. Sarah, can you remember the name for this specific little boxes?
You're asking a difficult question. I think it was something with Eddie at the start. Leave us a comment if you find out, and otherwise we will write the specific name for these types of bento boxes in the description. But that is, it's a specialized bento box that is specifically only sold in train stations and prepared for the commute. So the idea is to have it on the train and not just in a restaurant or at home.
Yeah. So, and especially Japan, having this tradition is, in my opinion, a very special case because especially in Europe, think of London or Vienna, it's forbidden to eat on public transportation. So this has various reasons, also because of cleaning and the smell that many transportation companies decided to ban food from their trains and buses. So, but in Japan, it's very common to eat on a train, but never in public space. So it's the opposite from many European cities and countries. So this was very interesting to me when I traveled within Japan. If you know any more examples, let us know in the comments. I'd be really curious about that.
Or maybe just share what the tradition is in your country. Is it common to eat in public transportation? It's kind of a specialized public space, and we will not go into detail on that, but it's quite interesting if we think of food in public space. Does that include public transportation for you, or would you say that is a no-go, or the other way around?
So, but selling food on the street could also be a livelihood strategy. So many people around the world sell food on the street as their business. So the public space becomes their business location. And it's also very common in many places to have street food as their daily lunch, basically. So this is very common.
And I think this is something that is very common all around the world. So I know that for me, one thing that always stuck in my mind is when I was staying in Maputo and Lesotho, that on the way to the border to South Africa, it would be lined with all these little grills that would sell different types of meats or vegetables, mostly corn, just to have either a snack on the way or actually to have your lunch. And as you were saying, also something that was very common was that actually these small food vendors would sell in front of big factories. So the factory workers would come for lunch at these small places. And so that is an important livelihood strategy, I think, for a lot of people. And then on another aspect, or in one thing that is mostly common in places that have very high motorization is food trucks. So I'm thinking specifically of the US there, and you can see on the picture that I shared, it's a very common practice to have these food trucks that sell food, both again for having it at lunch, while you're at work, because it's just a quick drive away with the car, but also as part of festivals, as part of more private gatherings. There's kind of this duality here as well. And yeah.
But it's also possible that people use the public space because of a lack of private space. So it happens at a lot of places around the world that people do very private acts on the street because of a lack of private space. So I have an example from Shanghai. While I studied in Shanghai, I conducted a survey for my master thesis, and it was actually about the mental image of Shanghai. So we also have an episode on that. But anyway, I wanted to have a very broad picture, or as broad as possible, of many Shanghainese. And so I strolled around with my friend who helped me translating in some lilongs. And lilongs are traditional houses in Shanghai, which are pretty small. So many people don't have their own kitchen, and it's very seldom that people have their own toilet and bathrooms. So normally they share public bathrooms and public toilets. And most people have their kitchens on the street in front of their house. So when I was walking by, I just stepped by when they were preparing their lunch. So there were two ladies cooking in front of their house, and me as a total stranger couldn't just come by and talk to them while they were preparing their food. So this is a very specific use of public space in a very private way, actually, in my opinion. And it's also a very special way of occupation because it's not a public kitchen.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure...
In preparing for this episode, we were also talking a bit about how it differs from, for example, communal kitchens, which are in their use very public, but are private in access. So they would probably be considered a club good as such, because they are in a house usually located and used by many, like you would consider probably also the public toilets that people share in the lilongs. But the kitchens themselves are used very communally, while from what Constanze was explaining to me about this situation, the use is much more private. It's just one family using the same kitchen, or sometimes shared between two households or a couple, but generally speaking very limited to in terms of who can use it, rather than being all access for a large variety of people.
Mm.
And then we also were considering, and I wanted to add that on in terms of food, using food and food production and eating as a means of livelihood strategy, that of course this can also be utilized by companies. So when in most European cities, a very, very common occurrence nowadays is just the coffee truck that is in front of every university, it feels like, and just popping up in gardens. Sometimes also in summer you will find ice cream stands, and of course sometimes these are very private enterprises in the sense that maybe I'm using the wrong vocabulary right now. It should be probably not small businesses, but these are also utilized by bigger companies as a strategy to distribute food, or to just give convenient access to food. So when you're thinking of a public park and an ice cream truck that is rolling by, that might be owned by a big corporation, but it's a small way to also bring food into public space by private companies. And sorry for this interruption. Now
No problem.
We'll go back to the topic of the private in the public. And I think I will just kick us off with the topic of the picnic. We have a picture that will also be our thumbnail. Nope, sorry, this one. And it's all about where can you eat in your city? How can you eat in your city? And I think when we consider the atmosphere that I experience here in Vienna, it is very easy to find a park bench or a park or some sort of public space where I can just sit down on the curb and eat my whatever, whether I bring that from home or I take it from a small vendor or a big vendor. And I remember many days of summer spent in front of the our university, which has a little fountain next to it. Well, it's not that little, the fountain, but it was always so crowded that it felt quite little. And to have this access to space where, yes, there were small food vendors, but you could also just bring your own food. And it, to me, was always very much characterized by the fact that it was non-commercial space. So instead of what we see a lot is... in our streets, for example, is these pop-up gardens or whatever by restaurants that can be used in terms of, if you eat at that restaurant, you can sit either outside or inside, and they might use public spaces like parking spaces that were in Vienna. We have this policy that you can apply as a restaurant owner to get a permit to use, I don't know, 2-3 parking spaces and make them into an extended part of your restaurant. But of course, those you can't just take your own sandwich and eat there. So I think that is a very important also idea when we talk about how we use public space. And even if a restaurant uses that public space, and I'm not sure if I'm explaining myself well, but a restaurant, a private company can occupy a public space, like by putting a little, in German it's called Schanigarten, exactly. And so
but private people can't. You cannot just go there and just occupy one parking spot by just sitting there, because in Vienna, I think in Austria in general, it's very clearly defined how parking plots and slots are actually allowed to use just for parking. So if you occupied it, if you're not have this specific allowance to put your little street garden there, you have to have 4 wheels. So this seems a little ridiculous. So one specific person can occupy a lot of space actually by just parking his or her car. But if 4 people or even more just get some chairs and occupy that, it's technically illegal.
And I think
that's the case in Vienna, I know. Yeah. So.
And I think that's also coming back to what we said before, that like the legality of the action is just defined by the specific countries or cities' circumstances, but it's not doesn't interfere necessarily with the fact that people do certain things or want to do certain things. And then we were talking a little bit about a specialized version of picnicking or of using public space for eating. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I have a story to tell about my trip to Hong Kong. I was on holiday in Hong Kong, and I walked through the streets, and it was a Sunday, I remember that. and many ladies, young to middle-aged, were sitting on the street having food and enjoying themselves. And I was wondering what those ladies were doing. I mean, I could see they were eating and enjoying themselves, but I was surprised about the fact that there were mainly ladies. I would say like 95% at least. And the place they were using, it was not a park, or it was just around the city, like nearly everywhere, close to underground stations, just on the sidewalks. So I couldn't tell why people, or especially those ladies, would just sit and picnic there. But I met a guy from Hong Kong, and I asked him what about those ladies. And he told me that those ladies are housemates. They are called aiyis, so ayi in Chinese. And they are working for more wealthy Hong Kong people. And they have one day off. It's Sunday. Sunday is their day off. And normally they have very poor living conditions. And even if they have their own room in the flat they are working at, it's usually pretty small. And sometimes they even not allowed to invite people. And so most of those aiyis meet in public because they have not the space at home or not the allowance of their employers. And that's why they meet in public. And this was a very interesting phenomenon to me, actually, because there were thousands on the street, and I was really surprised by that, actually.
Yeah. I think it's also quite interesting because when we talk about picnicking, what defines picnicking, and for me it would always be just bringing your food, your homemade food, or at least brought from home, to the public space to be consumed there. But of course there's a lot of fuzziness when it comes to this definition, because obviously what if I buy food from a supermarket and then eat it? Is that picnicking or not? Is it picnicking if I buy it from a food truck, for example? Probably I wouldn't consider that picnicking anymore. But then where is the line? So I would consider that a very fuzzy definition. But something that is really like encompasses for me is this liberty of just using public space. And I know in some cities there are very clear ordinances to where you can picnic and where you can't. There's also specific spaces where you can, for example, on the Danube island of Vienna, you can actually make a reservation for some public space. And then I'm not sure if that would still be considered a public space, because then it's assigned to you. Constanze, would you mind to mute yourself, because there's a lot of interference? Thank you. Because that was why I was hesitating before, because I didn't know if anyone could still hear me. So the thing about picnicking in public spaces, I think for me was just this this consideration of using this consumption-free, like non-compulsory consumption-free space. And so, yeah, that would be my wrap-up on the topic of picnicking. Do you want to add something to that, or should we finish up with the episode? So, to sum up, we wanted to explore a little bit of how cities mainly deal with food in public. And the main there's mainly three ways of dealing with food in public. There is ignoring it or tolerating it. So when you think of the example of the in Hong Kong, where people are just sitting around on the streets, or you're just being left to your own devices. It's not specifically forbidden or allowed, but it's just there. Then there is the completely other hand, where it's supported, where there's specific options, like for example water fountains or something like that, that encourages you actually to stay there and to maybe consume food in that space. And then I would consider more or less in between that there is a legal frame, so you can clearly know what is and isn't allowed and how that plays into it. Thank you very much for listening to our episode, and we hope you enjoyed yourself. See you in a month.
Bye.
This was Breaking Paradigms by Constanze Frech and Sarah Kusché. Be part of the conversation. If you like what we do, consider supporting us and join our Patreon community. Connect with us on Facebook, YouTube, and at breakingparadigms.org. Content and editing by Constanze Frech and Sarah Kusché. Sound design by Didac Barroso and